so I couldn't include all of that, but just to give you an idea of that kind of movement. And this use of perspective, which is basically like the quintessential image, I think, that we all have of the railroad, of that kind of vanishing point into the distance. But here, unlike in the foot images of the mountains or in the image of the small town, it isn't kind of this image of the wilderness, but more like this image of modernization, of civilization, of moving forward, progress through technology. And then here's just another example of a train coming the other way. And it's kind of like there's this blankness in the foreground and the reflection of the water, and then the train coming in is kind of in its reflection, and then the darkness in the background is kind of like, it's like the train is the one like bringing this world into being, I think. So these are just some slides for comparison, because I think that the photographs in the Villalba album represent a departure from most of 19th century photography, especially photography in the Latin American context, definitely, where most of the photography that was done was studio portraiture, images of people, and if not images of people, or portraits strictly per se, they were these kind of genre images produced in the studio with kind of a blurry, washed out background and a lot of props, costumes, or else they were the carte de visite kind of photography, which attempted to use photography to like establish these typologies of national character or of ethnic difference. So perhaps the most famous Peruvian photographer of the 19th century is Eugenio Puré, and this is an example of some of his photography. This is one of the rare instances where it's not in the studio. This is an 1863 image of a street in Lima. So just to give you that background. Next. And then this is an example of the more typical studio work, where you can see that there's this girl, this like aristocratic girl, all dressed up in a photograph, leaning against this fake rock with a painted backdrop, which is a more typical example. And then this is one of my favorite images. It's called, I think it's called Otras Flores Peruanas or something, which means like Peruvian flowers. I think it's also a Puré image, and he's kind of just like done this collage, photo collage, but yeah, this is definitely the main 19th century impulse, is portraits of aristocratic people, and here it's just kind of this mass profusion of that. Oh, this is a terrible image, sorry. But this is an example of the carte de visite, which was the other kind of main tendency. And this is an example from Colombia from the 1880s of, I think it's like, it's the title of the image is like an Indian basket carrier. So that would be much more typical, is to have these types. Sometimes it would be images of criminals or like the criminal physiognomy. And a lot in South America, it was a lot of times images of different Indians that would be circulated in the aristocratic circles, and then also in Europe as well. So, and then I just wanted to talk about how both Bingham and Villalba kind of deploy the images of landscape, especially the images of ruins, and how both of them kind of use the past in different ways, and like what the uses of the past and of the landscape are. This is just a quote from Scott McQuire, who wrote a book called Visions of Modernity, which is just about like theory of photography. And he says that Nostalgia for the lost past has frequently been the correlate of modernity's heroic quest to invent the future, and the characters have often been asked to carry a double burden on this journey, preserving what went before while reconstructing the borders of self, home, and community in the process, which I think is kind of an interesting comment on what photography does. It does like mark the past and serve as a space for memory, but also in its technological innovation, it looks towards the future. And I think that this is especially interesting in this case because I think that the use of photography to create a space for the past is what served to create both Bingham's vision of modernity, of himself as an explorer and of his place kind of in the United States, and then of Villalba's vision of what Peruvian identity was. Okay, I'm sorry this is so small. But this is another image of the engine, and then you can't really see it at all. But here, in this little window here, there's this figure. Oh, can you go back? There's this figure in that little circle of a woman. It's like the torso of a woman who looks like an aristocratic woman, and I'm not sure if it is a portrait, but it's this woman with her hair done up holding a fan. So I think there's a real, in Villalba's work, there's a real identification of this self with the engine, I guess, with himself as photographer, with that engine, the technology that like makes meaning and brings order to the landscape. So it's kind of the railroad and the railway as
what year is this?
Probably from the late 1870s or the 1880s. It's these are albumin silver prints. Kind of, yeah, the railway kind of as a metaphor for vision, as a metaphor for the camera.
And in Europe at this time, for many, it's the opposite. It's the invasion of, let us say, kind of capitalism. In Russia, for example, this is one of the central features of Tolstoy, who hates the trade because it's bringing in a world order that is destroying his special link with the peasantry, who have just been emancipated.
Okay.
And that's why Anna Karenina, when she dies under a train, it's not so the image of a train very often can have precisely the other kind of sense in 19th century Europe. Something that brings in something new that isn't necessarily positive. So,
well, thank you for saying that, because actually it relates directly to the next slide. So this is another image, which is, I think it's like right after that image of the engine, which is Chincheros, Pueblo de Indios is what it's called, is what the caption says. So that means Chincheros, a village of Indians. So this photographer, I think, is very deliberately trying to set himself apart from the Indians. I don't think that he has any affinity for the equivalent of Tolstoy's peasants. I think that the rail